everybody, Jason Burmis here, and we've got a very special program for you this evening. I thought it would be smart to get Robbie Martin, one half of MediaRoots.org. You can follow him at Fluorescent Gray. You can also check him out over at a very heavyagenda.com, and he is one half of, this is the Patreon for Media Roots. I'm sorry. MediaRoots.org is over here, but if you want to support him, this is the Patreon. He and his sister Abby do great work there, or just follow him on Twitter. And the reason I wanted to get you on, Robbie, is, we're now less than 48 hours away from, actually a little bit more, I guess, right? No, it's 9/9, so it would afternoon, like 36 hours and change away from that initial moment when the first World Trade Center was hit. And essentially, our foreign and domestic policy changed in this country drastically. And there has really been no looking back since. We continue to push forward with this quote-unquote war on terror in the Eurasian region. And it doesn't seem like it has any signs of slowing down. And what's the media running with? Oh, Trump wanted to have peace talks with some of the Taliban. God forbid, but then people died in Kabul, so he called it off, kind of get a flex move, and then everybody on the left can criticize him for thinking about talking to the terrorists, Robbie.
Well, I mean, didn't he sort of renege on that himself after he of that like suicide bombing or whatever happened that was apparently from the Taliban?
Yeah, the Kabul attack, that was his excuse. He said, I had secret plans for maybe peace talks, since I promised everybody we were going to be getting out of Afghanistan and I wanted to end these wars of aggression. They were going to come to Camp David. It was going to be the president of Afghanistan and some of the leaders of the Taliban, associates of Al-Qaeda now, But then an attack in Kabul cost the lives of 12 Americans, and supposedly the Taliban took credit, and Trump said he called off the negotiations. Now, he leads the tweet off with unbeknownst. I don't understand this. We want him to have peace talks with these people. Just because lives were cost doesn't mean we should disregard, the thousands of lives and the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Afghanistan lives that have been cost over the last almost 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, everybody should be encouraging peace talks with the Taliban. I mean, obviously, the regime, whatever the effort was over there, if it was regime change or whatever, clearly is not working. There's definitely mining operations happening there, where I think some major Chinese companies and other American companies are getting a lot of resources from, but I don't even know how successful that's been. So, yeah, they just need to call this whole thing over. They need to remove all the troops. But, Trump is just sending a lot of mixed signals in this, like he often does, where he announced previous to this reneging on these Taliban talks that he was going to keep 7,000 troops in Afghanistan indefinitely, after he, kept trying over and over again to make this announcement that he was going to remove all the troops or withdraw all of them. So it's kind of like, I mean, it is so absurd. Even when you just look at the original reasons for us going into Afghanistan, you don't even have to be a 9/11 truther to just see how it sits on a completely faulty logical premise. It's not any more valid than the Iraq War was when you really boil it down to the reasons why we allegedly, invaded in Afghanistan. I mean, there's so many bizarre things just about the Afghanistan war, not to mention, you want to talk about the Taliban coming to the United States. Well, the last time I remember them coming to the United States was to talk with the UNICAL executives to try to, create some kind of collaborative oil pipeline running through Afghanistan, and that it also involved the Clinton administration. And, we shouldn't forget that the Clinton administration also propped them up in the 90s. So this is not like, this is not some, completely foreign Al-Qaeda. Well, even when you want to talk about actual Al-Qaeda, the Mujahideen that we also funded. So this stuff always just happens to be it's kind of like a snake eating its own tail. So it's hard to talk about, without going back to the idea of that we've somehow propped these people up and supported them at one point, and now we're just back there trying to clean up the mess, and then we couldn't do it, so we're eventually just going to negotiate with them. But clearly, anybody who is anti-war should be supporting the effort. Any administration, doesn't matter how awful Donald Trump is in all these other ways. This should be encouraged. I think so. It's disheartening to see anybody using this as sort of like a political talking point against him. Similar to the North Korea talks. Like those are two good things Trump is actually trying to do. So that's my take on it.
Well, the thing is that you have people like Abe Knoblar, who has no base whatsoever, who they want as an establishment candidate for the presidency, going up and
I
saying,
didn't realize you were still running.
yeah, oh yeah. This isn't a game show, Mr. President. We don't meet with terrorists. And I got to ask her, well, you don't think any of our top military officials are having talks with the al-Nusra leaders over in Syria, or the white helmets that are connected to al-Qaeda? Oh, wait. They absolutely are. And when Tulsi Gabbard brings that up on stage, every single one of you chicken shits ignores it. They move on to the next subject and no one even challenges her on it. You would think that if we're talking about Trump meeting with terrorists, he's going to meet with the terrorists, that if he was working with the terrorists in Syria, that would be a great talking point to take him down. But that doesn't go with the establishment narrative. And another thing that's boggling to me is while we sit here and we talk about Afghanistan, still to this day, nobody talks about Pakistan whatsoever. They've completely erased the idea that the ISI was involved in funding it. But even further than that, the common people that actually believe that the bin Laden that they got in Abbottabad, Pakistan, who was being protected by the military for years, have no problem with them being our ally in the war on terror.
I mean, yeah, it's absurd. I mean, the Pakistan angle is interesting because that was, if people go back, that was sort of the start of what we know of as the drone war, even just in terms of our response, after 9/11. So not only were we collaborating in some capacity, or whoever did 9/11 was collaborating in some capacity with the ISI, we started bombing them with drones. And oddly, people might also forget this. This was actually something that Obama brought to the table. Like he went into his campaign, as the supposed peacenik. But one of the things he did also sort of put on the table that other candidates didn't from that time period was we need to expand the war on terror into Pakistan. And that's essentially what's happened since then. But there's an interesting historical tidbit, Jason, that you're probably familiar with, but maybe some of your listeners aren't. This is how the story goes, apparently, about how the Taliban originally took over Afghanistan. And it sort of comes off almost like a fairy tale, but it involves the CIA and the ISI, where apparently the Taliban was relatively small, much smaller than the whoever governed Afghanistan at the time period. I believe it was still the Northern Alliance in some capacity. And what happened was apparently the ISI, someone in the ISI got in touch with leaders from these, Taliban opposition militia, and gave them exact location data to hidden caves where the CIA stored munitions for the Mujahideen back during the war between the Soviet Union in the 80s. So apparently, this is what happened: is the Taliban were directed to all these munitions and essentially did a coup d'état on the government by using CIA weaponry in the first place. So, I mean, I don't know how much you know about that, but I find that a fascinating story.
Well, it shouldn't be that shocking, seeing as like you said, the Northern Alliance was fought by the Mujahideen, who was propped up by us while they were still supposedly kind of an enemy, but the Soviet Union was a bigger enemy. So we actually involved the ISI with that bin Laden network to not only start that conflict, but then, like you said, basically prop these people up, and it eventually leads to the Taliban. Now, after 9/11, and I'm so glad that you brought up the Taliban coming in pre-9/11 for that UNICAL meeting. Well, they said we're going to have that pipeline. It could be a carpet of gold, or it could be a carpet of bombs. That is an actual quote.
Wow.
Yeah, I've got to find that one, but I used to quote that one all the time. And of course, we know what ends up happening. But who do they install? Well, they install an ex-Chevron executive, Hamid Karzai, as that first, puppet president. He doesn't work out so well. There's actually several attempts on his life, but who knows what that's sponsored by. Even more interesting than that, after Hamid comes in, not only do they get their pipeline, but opioids explode throughout the world. And the number one producer of them happens to become Afghanistan, with Hamid Karzai's blood brother, Waleed, being the main opium dealer at the time. Of course, he eventually gets taken out in an assassination. But this shows you how things work. We have Geraldo Rivera on video in Afghanistan outside of these poppy fields that are being protected by U.S. forces. That video has been around for well over a decade, and it's not only forgotten, it's not even contested. It's like nothing to see here, Robbie. Nothing to see here at all.
Well, that's a whole other interesting rabbit hole in and of itself, Jason, is the whole illicit versus licit opium market. I just did an episode on Media Roots Radio where I interviewed this guy who went to Tasmania and visited what's known as the legal licit opium market, where certain designated countries are basically allowed to export this high potency opium poppy to produce all the opioid pharmaceuticals in the United States. So, it's kind of changed my thinking a little bit on what this all could be about in terms of the U.S.'s presence, with these opium poppies, and they're sort of protecting them or even maybe monitoring the supply of them, because there is a very strong relationship, obviously a crossover and sort of a push and a pull effect between the illegal opium market, which supplies the world's heroin supply, and the legal opium market, which supplies all the pharmaceutical opioids. I mean, they're made using the same materials. So even if we're just talking about, heroin, that's one thing, but they all come from opium poppies. It's not like they're making these things purely out of pure chemicals in a lab. They're importing tons and tons of opium poppies from other countries. They're just not supposed to be getting them from Afghanistan, but who the hell knows? I mean, we honestly don't know. But there is something to do. There is an important role that the CIA and other U.S. military forces have played in sort of monitoring the illicit drug market and sort of regulating it, and with these other paramilitary forces like in South America and stuff. So there's definitely some kind of component to that that plays into things. But I feel like that's a really opaque. It would be really interesting to see someone like make a full documentary on the situation of opium in Afghanistan, because I feel like a lot of people would be really interested to see something about that. I mean, I feel like it's a very opaque subject. We only can get little tidbits and breadcrumbs about what's actually going on, where that opium is going, But yeah, I think that's a whole other rabbit hole that you can spend a whole career researching that.
And I agree. Moving away a little bit from Afghanistan and even Iraq, we've discussed Iran a lot. And this summer, we saw a ramping up really in July. But then, August, the United States was kind of silent except for backing up some of the Israeli aggressions that took place in that region. Not only in Iran, but of course in Syria. And I think in a week-long period, Israel, I think they bombed 3 separate nations. I'm pretty sure Yemen, Syria, and Iran. I'm almost positive. I remember doing a report on that. But they've gotten more visibly aggressive. Obviously, we haven't backed down from their support. But there still is not a lot of chatter about Iran and the possibility of a real invasion in this country. What's your take on that?
Well, I think it was only 2 months ago where we were both extremely concerned that it was within days of happening. I mean, so there have been, there's sort of an ebb and flow to all this. So I think right now it's sort of died down on the surface, in terms of the media sphere. We're not seeing sort of the ramping up effect, the propaganda building in the media. And that's a really important component to how the war machinery ultimately works. So I think that's maybe a good sign. But as we know, all it will take is a spark in a situation like this for things to really heat up really quickly and explode. So I just really hope that they're not seriously considering this at the moment. I don't know if it's been put on the back burner, but there was a very, very serious effort, to do this just a few months ago. But there's something else interesting happening here where, I think Israel has sort of gone unchained a little bit more than they have been, maybe in the last 4 years or so. They feel more emboldened, perhaps by the Trump administration. There is definitely a symbiotic relationship there that I think is interesting in a way that's different from, but also has certain elements that are similar to the Bush era of the neocons in Israel. But it's definitely different in character. But in that regard, I mean, there was actually a story that leaked really recently. I don't know if you saw this, where it was recently revealed that the Obama administration was spying using spy satellites on Israeli military activity. There was some like counterintelligence sort of spycraft going on between, the CIA spying on Mossad activity. So it's really hard to say what our, real relationship is at this point with Israel. And at the same time, you have to imagine even just the Israeli art student scandal in and of itself. There has to be still people in intelligence communities who remember that and who are still really baffled by why that was allowed to happen. I mean, so I think Israel is acting super belligerent right now because they feel like they can get away with it. But I think Israel is also on borrowed time to some extent. I think that the world community is sort of pivoting more in the direction of believing that it is an apartheid country. It is doing, breaking international law in extremely over the top ways that are becoming increasingly unacceptable. But at the same time, they're being funded billions of dollars a year, tens of billions of dollars a year by the United States. So as long as that continues to happen, I don't think Israel's going to sort of reel in their belligerence anytime soon. It's not there. I don't think they're going to worry about the international community's opinion on them. So it's, it's a real shame. And, their Air Force and their, military is subsidized by us. But just the idea that they're, threatening Lebanon again is pretty crazy to me. I mean, they really decimated.
That was it, Beirut. There was an attack in Beirut,
yeah.
Wasn't there? Yeah.
I mean, that was one of the last times in world history a major sort of historical city was like decimated like that by an Air Force. So it's pretty disturbing. But as we know, Israel is really capable of anything. I mean, they're one of the most brazen countries, besides the United States in the entire world, and what they're capable of. So,
I would agree with that. And just today, Netanyahu put on another presentation, this time saying we have more unknown nuclear facilities and weapon sites in Iran. See, I told you so. And meanwhile, it's horrible that Hezbollah has downed an Israeli drone in ongoing tensions between Iranian-backed groups and Israel. Oh no, they shot down their spy robot, or worse, their death robot. They should be taken out and hung. It's unbelievable that people still don't get that, how would you feel if a foreign nation had death drones, death robots in the sky, and they were taking out weddings, that you knew some of those people, and those people were called terrorists? We are so blinded by consumerism, jingoism, ignorance in this country, and most people don't even realize it. No, they're too busy, Robbie, talking about transgender nonsense and whether or not we should shut ICE down, et cetera, et cetera. And to some extent, I guess that those things matter. But I don't know. Maybe the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions of lives that are being taken and destroyed every single year in those regions because of our policies might be a little bit more important.
Yeah, I mean, you would. It's just not a popular thing. I mean, there is, like I was saying on your programs several times already, that there is sort of a popular sentiment that sort of post-co-opted Tea Party, that people generally don't have an appetite for war, but it's not for the reasons you just described. It's not because it's not normally coming from a moral place. I think that most Americans, it takes a lot to process that, because it requires almost some atonement, or some, almost maybe like people maybe even experience some kind of guilt that is bothersome for them to experience about this idea that America is responsible for so much carnage, in these other countries, murdering people, for empirical ends, that I think that most people just would rather not think about it. So I think these other issues you're talking about are easier. They're smaller capsule issues that are easier for people to wrap their heads around. The media is all talking about it, so it sort of becomes a chorus. It's more of a herd mentality kind of issue. But at the same time, like, I mean, obviously those issues are important to me, especially like, just specifically the idea of ICE. I mean, people need to remember that is a homeland security apparatus. That's a post 9/11 sort of thing. So I'm very strongly rooted in the idea that we need to go back to before 9/11 in pretty much every single regard. Well, every single regard. So like I would include that with it.
Yeah.
But I could understand people's arguments for immigration enforcement, but we don't need ICE. We don't need Homeland Security vans driving around the United States. I mean, I saw one on the freeway, a Homeland Security van in Oakland, like 2 weeks ago, and I was just like, why do they have vehicles? Why are they driving around the freeway? It's just kind of creepy to see in general,
Yeah, no, I'm all with you. And, we can have border security without ICE because most people don't even remember a world without Homeland Security. That's how twisted things are. They're just so acclimated. I mean, we are in a generation now that hasn't really grown up without it, right? I mean, it's going to be 18 years, like we said. That apparatus, I want to say, Homeland Security was put into place, less than 6 months after 9/11? Maybe even less than 3 months after 9/11. The Afghanistan invasion took place in October after September 11th. So that was weeks. That was not months. And then it took them, about a year and a half to go into Iraq in 2003? And we've just kept expanding and expanding and expanding and expanding. And to me, Robbie, there doesn't seem to be any hope of withdrawal when, for the first time, we have a president that'll talk about the military industrial complex. He'll talk about wanting to get out of Afghanistan, like you said, out of one side of his mouth. And then the next thing that he says is, but those bastards killed 12 people, and they're not coming to my camp, David. So I think he's really good at playing both sides of whatever he thinks his base is, and what I think other people are telling him his base is. I wouldn't be surprised if there's still not backdoor communications with a guy like Bannon, for instance.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, Bannon did make a strange comment a few months ago, mentioning that Trump might have raped someone on Epstein Island. So I don't know if they're still in communication regularly or if there is a real rift there. It's hard to say, but I mean, yeah, it is really strange. I mean, I think Trump is in some ways smarter than he acts on like Twitter and in public, and I feel like he really is wrongly. I mean, like if we're just talking about strategically, like I hate him on a personal level for a lot of different things. I hate a lot of his policy, but just in terms of his strategy, I'm surprised that he's so often playing to the cheap seats and using sort of reptile brain rhetoric about like, those they killed 12 of our soldiers or those bastards, or, talking about we need to kill the terrorists and their families, or even just acting like, the Democrats are, the enemy of the people. Like I was just thinking today, like he seems smarter when he was talking about the deep state or the military industrial complex. But when he makes everything this base level partisan argument, I don't really understand what he's trying to accomplish. Like, and he's also doing that simultaneously with bashing Fox News when they don't toe his line enough. So it's like, dude, I mean, come on. Like it almost seems just really unnecessary strategically. So I feel like he needs to go back to his older formula of just like pulling out our troops. I mean, that is kind of a bipartisan thing that cuts through a lot of the other stupidity that he puts out. I mean, go back to that. But it just seems like he is a really good talker. But now, it's taken so long that his talk is starting to catch up with them, where people are, I think, starting to realize that, he did say all this shit that I really liked and actually in some way did support, like pulling out the troops, some kind of detente with North Korea, but it's all not really working out, And even if you are a partisan, the wall was a promise that's also not working out. So I hope that a lot of people are starting to, see him as just a really good talker who's not backing a lot of these things up. But I don't know, man. I mean, the QAnon thing, and there's still so much fuel, that seems to be feeding him that I don't know. I don't know what I don't really know where his head's at right now, honestly.
Well, that being said, Robbie, all those things, would be valid points to criticize this presidency on, not pulling out of the not pulling out with the troops, kind of messing up with North Korea. Although he hasn't escalated that, I'll give him that at least, you know what I mean? But here's the deal. They're going to hold a hearing tomorrow to try to proceed with impeaching this man based on imagination land and an obstruction of justice charge that had to do with an imaginary crime. I'm not saying the guy didn't break all sorts of crimes, or I'm sorry, break all sorts of laws. I absolutely am. I think the guy's a criminal. Don't get me wrong. I told people when he came into office, and by the way, again, I voted for him. 1,000 times better than Hillary Clinton.
I didn't know you voted for him.
What? Yeah, I did.
I
voted for him. Listen, I voted for him in New York thinking that he would even get more votes than they said he got in New York, knowing, what a liberal or left-leaning places. But yeah, over Hillary Clinton, listen, I couldn't vote Gary Johnson. I couldn't find, after he didn't know about Aleppo and he started kind of going with those mainline Hillary Clinton talking points, even though I'd interviewed the guy, I couldn't do it. And I said, you know what? Well, he talks a good game. He says he's going to have the superhero cape on. I'd love to see it, and we're here now. But I still don't think that he should be impeached for imagination land crimes. He was right about being spied on by the FBI while he was running for president. That's a real thing. He never colluded with Russia. That's a real thing. They literally tried to get him in a perjury trap, and when they couldn't get him to testify, what did they have to do? They had to settle for some of his underlings in backdoor business deals like Paul Manafort and others. Then go after his scumbag lawyer, who obviously has a bunch of scumbag skeletons in his closet. None of this, in my opinion, is grounds for impeachment, and to me, it's going to cause further distractions from the very real issues that we just discussed in the previous 20 minutes, Robbie.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I want to see Trump somehow get out of there, or but for this is the worst reason possible to do it. You could not choose a worse, more illogical, useless, and frankly damaging reason to impeach him over. And I say damaging because, like, the Mueller hearing being over and the report being released seems to sort of tamp down some of the hysteria for now. And obviously, if this happened and it really started gaining traction, the hysteria is going to come right back. And it's going to be, we're going to get it bombarded at us 24/7, just like we were during the Russiagate fiasco. And then, of course, on top of that, piggybacking on if there are impeachment hearings on Trump over Russia, piggybacking on that's going to be, Russian disinformation bots are putting out disinfo about the impeachment hearings and making these people look bad, but it's actually a Russian source and it's coming from a Russian bot on Twitter. And
the Russians support Tulsi Gabbard, god damn it, they do.
Exactly. Yeah, they've found every possible conceivable in already. And that's going to be like a luge for them. They're going to fly right down that. Be like, this is great for our propaganda. Let's use these impeachment hearings to blast out another 5 months or whatever the hell of anti-Russian hysteria again.
For instance, on the Russian hysteria angle, I'm not sure if you caught it, but I did a whole video on it. Meghan McCain, Joy Behar, and Whoopi Goldberg piled on Pamela Anderson. Now, I don't love getting into celebritard culture, but when she's going to be the only person in the country that has spoken positively about Julian Assange in the past fucking month on fucking television, the guy that literally got us the documents that showed the horrible torture in Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo Bay, and others. The guy that showed us the corruption in those goddamn emails. And much, much more, and he just published them. He gets called a cyber terrorist and a friend of Putin by fucking Meghan fucking McCain, Joy Behar, and even Whoopi Goldberg's like, he hurt some people. He hurt people. Who the fuck cares? This is the predator class. I wish he'd hurt them more. What are you talking about? They're not your fucking friends. And for them to pile on her, man, that just shows you the level of even when people cheered her on in the fucking thing, they edited most of it out. I saw a couple edits, and then they let that monster McCain, when somebody was like cheering her on, go, "Oh, come on, sir. Oh, please, sir." Like, I mean, are they that against free speech in this country?
I mean, I think on some level, what you're witnessing, Jason, I actually see this segment, but I can only imagine. I mean, I've seen similar things that Meghan McCain, said utter stupidity and just, basically towing her father's neocon, Cold War 2.0 line. But I think what you're seeing is it's people are still super raw and emotional over the fact that they think WikiLeaks, threw the election of Donald Trump with the help of Russia, and they simply cannot get over that. It's like it's so painful for them, so traumatic for them that Donald Trump won the election that they just still cannot process that. If the WikiLeaks did cause any damage to the election, it was almost negligible. I mean, in terms of like what kind of sway it had over it. I mean, but I honestly, I think if Hillary Clinton won, Julian Assange's standing in this country and even among like the celebrity class wouldn't be that necessarily bad. It's because he is blamed for Hillary's loss, and they just find that so painful and so egregious that he's now the enemy. I mean, that's why that you don't see anybody from the celebrity class or anybody going to bat for Assange after he's been detained, or anything. I mean, I personally have criticisms of Assange for completely different reasons. And, I even find it hard to voice some of those in the community that I'm in, because it's like coming from my world, it's sort of like, unless you give full-throated support to him, then you're sort of looked down upon. But, I mean, I think it's absolutely just like going after Trump for Russia. This is the stupidest thing you can go after Assange for. I mean, it still has not been proven at all that Russia supplied those leaks. There is no evidence that that's what happened. And I think we really need to keep reminding people of that. Regardless of what all these media organizations are saying, show me the evidence that Russia supplied these leaks to WikiLeaks. And even if they did, for devil's advocate's sake, even if they did do that, all the leaks were true. Everything in those documents were true, and they revealed real corruption. So you're not going to get mad at those people. I mean, it's just pathetic. They should be upset that Bernie Sanders was robbed of the nomination. I mean, that's subversion of the democratic process in the United States. I mean, you would think that liberal celebrities would be pissed at that,
Well,
if
you
they
would
were
think that Bernie would have stood up for himself and said it.
Well,
I think that's the biggest
Yeah.
problem. Like
Yeah.
that's the biggest problem. How do you throw your weight behind a guy that wouldn't even stand up and be like, yes, they fucked me? like, come on. That's the biggest problem. That's why from as many, and there's not a bunch, but there's certain things I certainly agree with Bernie Sanders on, right? I really can't throw my weight behind him because he had every chance in the world to stand up and fight harder. If he couldn't even fight that one basic lie within his party, how the fuck is he going to take on Wall Street? And I'm sorry that in the second half of this interview, I'm dropping F-bomb after F-bomb, but I get upset about this. I think this is the stuff that we should be getting upset about. Going back to Russiagate and Mueller, for instance, I think it would be really interesting after seeing Mueller really fumble up there every time there was any legitimate question about that investigation, and how terribly he did, even when he was throwing softball after softball for people on his political side, if you will, even though they present him as a Republican. Who cares? It's not a real two-party system. He's part of that predator class. He likes to cover up for them. Can you imagine if he was put on the stand in a truthful investigation into 9/11 and the FBI cover-up at this point? He would look like a senile old I mean, I would think that, even the most uninformed person in this country that lived through 9/11 as an adult would sit there and look at it and be like, holy shit, this is the guy we trusted and believed? I mean, give me 20 minutes with that guy to ask real questions. I think he looks like a buffoon at this point.
Well, look at on any of the examples of that ever happening with any officials that had any serious role in the administration during 9/11. Look at how they handled the pressure. I mean, Condi Rice, nearly crumbled. I'm trying to remember other examples of when people were actually asked, and that wasn't even a real, that's not a real criminal investigation. So if any of those people were actually put in, in a witness stand, like with a judge and a jury, I mean, they would have a seriously hard time. There's one other example I can think of where that's happened. I don't know if you remember, John Ashcroft had to testify in the civil trial when Stephen Hatfield sued the U.S. government after John Ashcroft said he was a person of interest in the anthrax attacks.
Mm-hmm.
Sued him for $6 million, or they settled out of court for $6 million. But there's a deposition of John Ashcroft literally answering the lawyer's questions, I don't know, 89 times. And he just does it with like a total stone face. Like, so that's how those people manage to power through it. You know, that's the best they can do, is just literally stonewall any questions. I mean, I think that was honestly Robert Mueller's best attempt that he thought he could do, of actually just stonewalling it. I mean, but he ended up looking more senile and actually like he was, you know, had something wrong with him than he was stonewalling. But I kind of, that was my impression of it.
You know, you talked about trials and questions. Another big news story earlier in the week that I covered is the fact that now we have a date set in 2020 for these show trials for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and 4 other defendants for the crimes of 9/11. So these things are going to take place, Robbie, almost 20 years later. No real jury, just really judges and executioners, let's be honest. And I think that, you know, when the time comes, they're going to slowly hype this up, ramp it up, remind us that there is a war on terror, continue to instill fear in people, and then really not only gain acceptance for this type of behavior, military tribunals, no judge, no jury, I'm sorry, no jury at all, just a judge, just an executioner, no due process whatsoever, but have people cheering for it and saying, finally, you know, we had that reminder, what was it, in 2011, 2012, when they said they caught Bin Laden, we got him! And now we got the bastards. And I mean, are we also going to show the public executions of these motherfuckers too? I mean, what's your take on the timing of this now that they're talking about these military tribunals finally?
You know, it's interesting. I mean, how long has this been going on? I don't know if there's any significance to the actual timing of it. There might be. But this sort of comes up, you know, I already assumed that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was like already actively on trial, and it was just like taking a really long time. But there have been other trials that have already happened. Like someone who was a driver for someone who worked with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is like actually still in Gitmo. There are several people in there who, if you really look at it, they have almost no provable connection whatsoever to 9/11. But for some reason, we have detained them there indefinitely. And in these trials, I mean, they're the most, you know, clear example of a kangaroo court that's happened in this country in my lifetime, where the actual defense lawyers that are assigned to these people, you know, because they have a right to an attorney technically, even though they're enemy combatants, these attorneys are constantly surveilled. So they actually don't have attorney-client privilege, even though they're technically supposed to. So what the U.S. military does down there is they violate the law, and they actually surveil all the internal communications that these defense lawyers even try to have with these, you know, detainees. And worst case scenario, the actual lawyers who represent them, they have their own living quarters on, you know, the Guantanamo base that they go back to. You know, they stay there to work out things with their clients. And I've been told that they are actually worried about having any private conversations in their own living quarters. They do not trust that the military is not surveilling them in their own homes, essentially, too. So this is a completely unfair trial by any measure. The evidence is doctored or cherry-picked in most instances. It's extremely skint. There's hardly any evidence to connect most of these people to the 9/11 attacks. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is their best example. But if you already look at his testimony, Jason, and you've probably seen this, there's a transcript of him admitting to being behind every major terrorist attack since like 1992. He admits to over like 24 terrorist attacks, being the mastermind behind everyone. That is absolutely cartoonish on its face. Anyone who believes that should have their head examined. I mean, just look at the transcript. They twisted his arm and got him to say all that stuff somehow. I mean, you know, we don't have to guess how. We already know they waterboarded him over 140 times. That's probably one of the ways they did it.
Threatened to kill and rape his son. That's another way in these documents that I've read. In fact, you know, when we were talking about these show trials earlier in the week on this program, I pointed out the fact that Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo Bay, and some of these other black sites are a place where children were sexually abused period, by U.S. soldiers, and almost, if anything, nothing was done. And that we had other people that were sexually abused with broomsticks and other objects. There was battery acid used in some of these cases. Many, many, many women were sexually assaulted in all these separate areas. So this is a reality. You know, we're talking about real torture. We're talking about real sexual abuse. We're talking about real threats. We're talking about real sensory deprivation that we kind of procured through MK Ultra, where they literally would put, goggles over these people so they couldn't see anything, have them in a full body suit, have them in mittens, have them covered head to toe. And, if they wanted to, they'd take the earpieces off of them and torture them by listening to music like the Barney song over and over and over again. I went through a list about a dozen of these songs, and it's absolutely appalling that we would do this. I mean, this is torture. That's what torture is, and that's the kind of psychological depravity that we did to other human beings. Think about that. How quick would you break being in a desert over 100 degrees, spending 16 hours a day outside in full garb while being tortured on the outside, occasionally kicked, occasionally shoved, or much worse, Robbie? They would have admitted to landing on the moon.
Yeah, I mean, every single form of torture you can imagine was used. I mean, it's the whole idea that waterboarding was used because it wasn't quite at the level of like what's considered normal torture, so that's why they use it so often, is false. There are tons of reports, dozens of reports of rape, sexual assault, psychological threats like we're going to kill or rape your child. That's not described in these torture reports. They also there's also examples of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay having their genitalia sliced up with razor blades, and this has been widely reported. This is not like an obscure, tidbit off some conspiracy website. You really have to dig for these things because I believe, this is actually an example of a limited hangout. The Bush administration needed to air some of their dirty laundry. They needed to throw all these people in Abu Ghraib under the bus, say they were bad apples, say the CIA did waterboard, they did do some sleep deprivation stuff and that kind of stuff, but we tried really hard to have John Yoo, write us this memo that made it all legal and all clean. But that's a false narrative. They did much, much, much worse than that. And they actually had a policy to even psychologically torture the detainees using female CIA agents, using psychological torture about their religion. They would actually have, this is a policy they called sexing up, where female CIA agents at Gitmo would pretend to rub menstrual blood on the faces of detainees. So, knowing any Orthodox religion, whether it's Judaism or, Islam, that's a considered an extremely, horrible thing to do. So it's just they looked at it basically from every single angle, and these are not things you'll see in popular movies about the waterboarding or whatever, because a lot of that stuff just comes from sort of the limited hangout narrative about what happened. Well, we know it was far worse than that, and on top of that, why even call them enemy combatants in the first place? Talk about show trials. Gitmo itself is like a show gulag. These people were thrown into a black hole so that there would be no accountability, so that people could never really figure out what they were guilty of, who they were associated with. Everything is pretty much opaque, and it's done on purpose so that it could seem like we really did something. We really got some bad guys and brought them into this, secret prison in Cuba. Look how hardcore we are. We're not going to let them talk to lawyers or whatever. But the reality is a lot of these people are probably completely innocent. We really have no idea. And we already know a lot of them have been released. And have been proven to have been just captured by the Northern Alliance because they looked Arab in the early days of the Afghanistan war. So it's pretty disturbing. And what happened to closing Gitmo? I guess Obama, didn't manage to fulfill that promise. So now it's just off everybody's radar. I guess it's just going to stay open forever now, Jason. You never hear anybody talking about that.
Yeah, no, and that was one of those things that fooled people into voting for him, and I just never trusted that he would do that. I saw that this was an establishment guy that was being pushed when he was a state senator, not even a senator. And I knew that there was just nothing you could trust about that guy. And what did we get? We got 8 more years of the same types of policy that we had for 8 years under the Bush administration. And, we've seen a little bit of a shakeup with this Trump administration, but not so much in the Middle East. In fact, in the Middle East, in Africa, we've only seen more of the same. And like you said, even though he came in here saying, we're going to get out of Afghanistan, we're going to get out of Iraq, we don't need to be in Syria, Obama, that was a huge mistake. Well, now we're staying in all those places. We're vetoing bills that essentially say, hey, maybe we shouldn't be providing the bombs and targets and hardware for that war in Yemen. Right? So now we're also involved in a war in Yemen, 100%. And they want to be involved in a war with Iran. And the crux of all of it, Robbie, is 9/11, which anniversary is just around the corner. I want to close on the latest report that has been put out, the Fairbanks, Alaska report on World Trade Center 7, 120 plus pages. I went over the last 30 of those pages pretty extensively on this program, talking about the computer models and talking about the fact that the NIST model and the NIST hypothesis that I believe took over 7 years to even develop. Not only did it come up with a new phenomenon that has never before happened and never since been replicated, thermal expansion to take down a 47-story skyscraper, but it seems like it's crickets in the mainstream media, other than a couple of obscure, very small articles, Yahoo Finance being one, about this paper even existing.
Well, don't you know, Jason, bringing up Building 7 is stupid and kooky, and only crazy idiots, conspiracy people bring that up? I mean, so, that's the reality of the situation. I mean, this is the mainstream media is not going to touch it because it's been beaten into the ground that you essentially, get shamed if you even become curious about Building 7, which is ridiculous because anyone in their right mind, any person would have to admit honestly to themselves, if you're just watching that video, you have to at least admit that it looks exactly like a controlled demolition. You don't have to agree that it is one because nobody knows 100% what happened. But come on, it looks exactly like a controlled demolition. So that's why Building 7 falling has been such a powerful, lasting image in the truth movement. It's one of those things that, it can't be debunked. It can't be written off as, the plane hitting the Pentagon thing. Well, what about these cameras at the Citgo gas station? It's something that I think will always remain. And I think it's really good that the University of Fairbanks, I don't know what the professor's name was. I've forgotten it. But that they've actually focused specifically on Building 7, because I do think that's sort of an in that the general public, if they saw the videos for it, if they were just told a little bit about it, they would, I think most curious people would honestly want to know more. Unless they've already gotten sort of the pre-written narrative that you're an idiot for asking any questions about it, and sort of scared to. But I think Building 1 and 2, it's a little harder for people to grasp. But I've told people this many times that I don't know exactly how it was done. I don't even really theorize too much about it anymore, Jason. After the Stephen Jones era and that kind of thing, I don't know if it was thermite. I don't know how it happened, but I guarantee you that those buildings were blown up, both 1 and 2 and 7. So if it's taken this long for an independent group of people to put together something on 7. It doesn't give much hope for us eventually getting to 1 and 2, but maybe the hope's still out there. Maybe we can get people to that place eventually, but this is a really good place to be, I think, in general, that they've, and what are you competing against? A multi-million-dollar organization like NIST. That's quite an accomplishment for an independent group of people to get together and be able to do this. So hats off to them for doing it, and I hope it gets more attention. I didn't even have a chance to tweet about it yet or anything because I didn't even read it, but I've been seeing a lot of people talking about it in the last few days.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's been out for 6 days now, but you wouldn't know it by the mainstream media. A veryheavyagenda.com is the website. You can also check out his work over at MediaRoots.com. You can support them over at patreon.com/MediaRootsRadio. He's got a YouTube channel. Robbie, is there anything else you would like to say to the audience before closing out, my friend?
I mean, just on the topic of Israel, if anyone's interested in what's going on over there right now, my sister Abby Martin just released an excellent full-length documentary about the struggle of Palestinians. It sort of centers around the Great March of Return protest. Lots of original footage, and most of it is exclusive footage filmed by Palestinian videographers that worked with Abby. It's an incredible watch, so definitely go check it out. It's called Gaza Fights for Freedom. And I do a podcast with Abby every week, and we'll have a new episode probably coming out in a few days, Media Roots Radio. So check that out as well.
Well, Robbie, as always, I thank you, and we'll definitely have to get together for the next Democratic debate that I think is just around the corner, so we'll definitely have to set that up. And as always, I thank you for your time, and I'm going to be doing your show on 9/11 sometime.
Yeah, for sure, man.
All right,
Don't
sounds
know what
great.
time yet. I'll let you know. Thanks for having me, Jason.
Thank you, brother. We'll talk to you soon. Guys, that's
Take care.
Robbie Martin. He does a great job. I want to let everybody know that I myself am a documentary filmmaker. You can see 2 of those films on 9/11 right now, Loose Change, Final Cut, Fable to Enemies, over at my YouTube channel, also Invisible Empire, New World Order Defined, and Shade the Motion Picture. All right here, all free. If you enjoy this type of video, if you enjoyed the truth, deep dives, different perspectives, things that aren't about left or right, but about right and wrong, please subscribe right now. Ring that bell for notifications so you know when we do go live, because like I said, we're doing it 3 to 7 times a day. And if you can, I'm doing this with your help. I don't have a Patreon. I don't have a Subscribe Star. I don't have any of that stuff. I have a monthly GoFundMe. We're a bit behind right now, but that's okay. You know, we might not have to hit 5K every single month. We're doing all right, and I'm doing it with you guys, so I thank you so much. With that being said, I'll see you all on the flip side.